Sometimes truth doesn't speak, it barks. Have you ever attended a funeral where the silence was so heavy, even the birds seemed to hush in mourning? But then imagine that silence shattered by a dog's frantic barking. Not just once, not out of grief, but as if it were warning us, accusing, knowing. This is the story of how a loyal animal, one that many saw as insignificant, unveiled the darkest secret buried beneath a polished coffin. And how a single question from a man changed the entire town of El Carmino forever. Chapter 1. The Man in the Mahogany Box. It was a sunless morning in El Carmino, a sleepy village nestled between wind-bent hills and whispering woods. The townsfolk gathered in somber rows along the stony path leading up to the chapel of St. Oliver. A coffin, gleaming with a mahogany sheen, lay before the altar, flanked by candles whose flames flickered not with breeze, but with unease. Inside the coffin lay Father Aurelio, the town's spiritual guide for nearly 3 decades. A man many respected, some feared, and few truly knew. The church bells tolled. The scent of incense mingled with the cold breath of winter. It should have been a quiet, reverent affair. But it wasn't, because beneath the pews, growling low and sharp, a dog sat restless. His fur was mottled, his eyes fierce with a kind of sorrow that bordered on rage. His name was Togo. No one had seen him before. He had no collar, no leash, and yet he acted like he belonged to the deceased or to someone long gone. When the coffin was wheeled in, Togo growled. When the priest began his sermon, Togo barked short, loud, defiant. The villagers shifted nervously. The new officiating priest, Father Miguel, stumbled over his words. Something was wrong. Chapter 2. The Returned Son. Among the crowd stood Luis Santiago, a man in his early 40s who had left El Carmino 2 decades earlier after a bitter argument with his family. His return was unannounced, and his face unreadable, stoic, like the mountains that framed the village. He watched the scene from the shadows of the back pew. Unlike the rest, his eyes weren't on the casket. They were on the dog. Luis remembered a dog just like this one. 20 years ago, his younger sister Camila had a pup, same white patch on the chest, same wild eyes. But that dog had vanished the same week Camila died. They said she drowned. They said it was an accident. But Luis never believed it. Now, watching Togo bark at the coffin of a man said to be a saint, Luis felt his gut twist with a dread he hadn't known since his sister's funeral. Chapter 3. The Priest Who Sweat Incense. Father Miguel tried to ignore the barking. He dabbed at his temple with a silk cloth, hands trembling as he spoke of sin, redemption, and the mysterious ways of God. But Togo would not let him be. Each time the priest spoke the name Aurelio, the dog barked. Harder, louder, until it felt like the church itself was vibrating. An old woman whispered, "It's a demon." A younger man muttered, "It's grief." Luis finally stood. His voice broke through the murmuring crowd. Why is the dog barking at the coffin? The question was simple. But in El Carmino, where secrets had the courtesy to stay buried, it was blasphemous. Father Miguel went pale. The cloth slipped from his hand. The dog barked louder. The priest's voice cracked. I don't know. It's just an animal." But Luis didn't sit. "That's not just any animal. That dog belonged to my sister Camila, the one who died 20 years ago, when she was just 16. Gasps filled the room like smoke. Chapter 4. The Ghosts of Camila. Camila Santiago. Her name had not been spoken aloud in years. She was the girl with the sunflower laugh, always chasing butterflies in the orchards, her hands always sticky with mango sap. But she had changed. Near the end she had grown quiet, withdrawn. Her skin turned pale. She had stopped going to church. Then one day she was found face down in the river. Father Aurelio had presided over her funeral too. At the time, Luis had demanded an investigation. He remembered seeing bruises on her neck that didn't look like drowning. But the priest had hushed him. The town had turned on him. "You shame her memory," they had said. "You bring scandal to the church." So Luis left. And now, 20 years later, a dog that should be long dead was barking at the coffin of the man who buried her. Chapter 5. Whispers at the Wake. After the funeral, the townsfolk gathered at the community hall for the wake. But the usual platitudes and pastries were nowhere to be found. Instead, there were whispers, murmurs, suspicion. Luis walked up to Father Miguel, who now sat alone, hands trembling as he sipped wine like it was water. Luis sat opposite him. You knew him. You served under him. You have his notes, his confessions. What are you afraid of? The priest's eyes welled up. There are things he never wrote down. Tell me. He had preferences, dark ones we feared. He always wore gloves, said it was for hygiene. But I once saw his hands. Scars, scratches, like claw marks. Luis froze. Togo whined and rested his head on Luis' lap. And in that moment, Luis knew the dog wasn't barking at a man. It was barking at the monster inside the man. Personal insight. Sometimes what we call insanity in animals is just truth unspoken. A dog does not bark for theatrics. It barks when it sees what we refuse to. There is something deeply uncomfortable in realizing that evil can wear robes. That a coffin can be too small to contain all the secrets buried with a man. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the silence of a town that knew and chose not to listen. Chapter 6. The Locked Room. The next morning, the air in El Carmino was thick not with mist, but with suspicion. The priest's funeral had ended, yet no one had returned to normal. People avoided eye contact. The streets seemed quieter. And Togo, the dog who had stirred the storm, sat faithfully by Luis' side like a guardian of the dead. Luis returned to the rectory behind the chapel, the place where Father Aurelio had lived for over 30 years. It was still sealed, untouched since the death. But something in his gut told him that the answers weren't buried with the priest, they were hidden behind his locked doors. With a firm push, Luis broke the lock and stepped inside. The air was stale, pungent with candle wax, old wood, and something else. Something sour. Dust danced in the light spilling from the stained glass windows. Religious icons lined the walls, but they no longer inspired reverence, they looked like witnesses to something unspeakable. Togo growled low, ears pinned back. His nose twitched as he led Luis down the corridor, stopping at a dark wooden door at the end of the hall. A plaque read, "Private Study, Do Not Enter." Luis entered. Chapter 7. The Journals of a Saint. The room was colder than the rest of the rectory. Bookshelves lined the walls, stuffed with theological texts, journals, and handwritten letters. But what caught Luis' eye wasn't the crucifix above the desk, nor the dusty chalice on the shelf. It was a series of leather-bound journals hidden beneath a false bottom in the desk drawer. He opened the first one. She reminds me of Eve. Innocent, curious, but temptations must be punished, even in paradise. The handwriting was unmistakably Father Aurelio's. Page after page, Luis read twisted reflections, masked as spiritual struggle. But they revealed something more disturbing, an obsession. Camila's name appeared again and again, not with love or mourning but possession. She looks at me now with suspicion. The dog growls at my shadow. I cannot have eyes watching me while I purge her soul of darkness. Luis' hands trembled. He could barely breathe. These weren't the words of a grieving priest, they were the confessions of a predator. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Confessional. Luis took the journals and walked back toward the chapel. He entered the confessional booth, not to seek forgiveness but to listen. He slid open the wooden panel between the booths. Silence. And then, faintly, the memory of a voice echoed in his head, Camila's. He touches me when he thinks no one's watching. I told Mama. She slapped me, said I was cursed. But I know it's him. Luis could almost feel her presence there, like the walls themselves remembered. What broke him wasn't just the pain in her words, but the truth that no one had listened. Not then. Not until a dog barked at a coffin. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Never Left. Outside, an old woman watched the chapel from across the road. Her name was Inés Delgado, once the housekeeper of the rectory. She was nearly blind now, her eyes glazed with cataracts. But when Luis approached her with the journals, her eyes grew wide not from surprise, but recognition. I knew, she whispered. I knew what he was. But what could I do? I was a woman. uneducated. Luis asked her if she remembered the day Camila died. She nodded slowly. She came to me that morning, said she was going to run, said she couldn't take it anymore, that the priest had touched her dreams and now she couldn't sleep, that the dog barked at the door every night like it knew something was wrong. Luis pressed, "Why didn't you stop her?" Ines wept. "Because I was afraid, and because when I told the others they said I was jealous, that I was trying to ruin a holy man's reputation." And just like that, it was clear the silence hadn't been ignorance. It had been complicity. Chapter 10. Bones under the altar. Determined, Luis returned to the chapel that night with a flashlight, Togo by his side. He remembered something else from the journals, a line that said, "God forgives what the earth conceals." He looked at the stone floor beneath the altar. Togo barked. The exact same bark from the funeral. Luis dropped to his knees and ran his fingers along the edges of the floor. A faint seam. A section that didn't quite fit the rest of the tiles. With effort he pried open a slab. The smell hit him first, then the bones. Small, fragile, human. Wrapped in the remnants of what looked like a girl's dress. Luis collapsed backward. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about Camila anymore. She wasn't the only one. Chapter 11. The names in the wall. Behind the altar was a wooden panel. Hidden behind it, Luis found something that shook him to his soul. Names. Etched into the wood one by one. Camila Santiago. Lucia Ramirez. Eva Torres. Talia Moreno. Dozens of them. Girls. All local. All reported missing or drowned or run away over the years. Each followed by a date. Each coinciding with a day Father Aurelio had preached about temptation. Personal insight. When a community protects its symbols more than its children, it is no longer a sanctuary, it's a shrine to silence. Evil rarely hides in shadows. More often, it hides in plain sight, wearing holy robes and preaching virtue. But truth has a way of scratching from beneath the surface until even a dog can smell it. Chapter 12. The report that never reached. The morning sun rose with a strange indifference, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets of El Carmino. Luis walked into the local police station with the journals in one hand and photos of the bones in the other. Togo remained in the truck outside, tail still, sensing the storm that brewed behind those walls. He slammed the evidence on Officer Miguel Herrera's desk, a man known more for his mustache than his morals. "I want a formal investigation into Father Aurelio's crimes. Multiple victims. I found bones under the altar. Names. Dates. Everything is in these journals." Miguel barely glanced at the papers. "You're accusing a dead priest. A man this town revered. Buried with honors." Luis leaned closer. "I'm accusing a predator who wore God's robes and buried children beneath a church." Miguel sighed, then slowly folded the folder closed. "You know what happens when you start digging too deep, Luis?" Luis didn't blink. "Yeah, you find the truth." Chapter 13. Truth versus tradition. That night, whispers moved through El Carmino like wind through dry leaves. Some said Luis had gone mad. Others said the priest was framed by Satan. A few, very few, whispered in corners, "We always knew something was wrong." Luis knew what he was up against. He wasn't just fighting for Camila. He was fighting a legacy. Father Aurelio had baptized generations, married lovers, buried elders. His sermons had been replayed on local radio every Sunday for 15 years. People didn't want a monster, they wanted a saint. That's when Luis received the call. It was Ines Delgado. "They came to my house," she whispered. "Told me not to speak again. That the church forgives what God forgets." Luis felt cold. It wasn't just Miguel. It wasn't just fear. It was a system. Chapter 14. The Archbishop's Visit. Days later, a black car with tinted windows pulled up in front of the chapel. Out stepped Archbishop Manuel Reynoso, a man cloaked in crimson silk and unshakable poise. He found Luis waiting for him at the church gates. "Luis Moreno," the Archbishop said with a half-smile, "you've stirred the waters." "Sometimes the water needs stirring," Luis replied. They walked inside. The archbishop examined the altar floor, which had been resealed. You've made quite the claim. Bones, journals, a dog that barks at a coffin. But the dead do not speak, Senor Moreno. Luis held up one of the journals. But the living do, and I won't stop until their truth is heard. The archbishop sighed. You think exposing this will save the town? You'll destroy it. Faith is fragile. Without it, people crumble. Luis looked him dead in the eyes. Faith isn't built on lies. It survives because of truth. The archbishop didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said everything. He wasn't here to protect Luis. He was here to bury what remained. Chapter 15. The Mother Speaks. 2 days later, a woman arrived at Luis' doorstep. Tall, weathered. Her eyes held the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Her name was Rosa Santiago, Camila's mother. She held a single photo in her trembling hands. Camila, age 9, holding Togo's puppy form. I was told not to talk, she whispered. Told by everyone. My husband, the priest, even the mayor. Luis invited her inside. Rosa unfolded Camila's final, drawing a crude crayon sketch of a girl crying inside a black box, surrounded by red crosses. She gave me this the day before she died, Rosa said. I burned it, thought it was blasphemy. Tears welled in her eyes. I let them silence her. I let them silence me, but not anymore. Luis took her hand. This time we speak. Chapter 16. The walls tremble. Word spread fast. Within a week, over a dozen women came forward. Some were young, some now elderly, but their stories bled from the same wound. A priest, a touch, a whisper, a warning to stay silent. Luis documented everything. He recorded their testimonies. He filmed the chapel, the journals, the hidden names in the altar. But then his house was broken into. The journals were gone. Photos deleted. Testimonies erased from his hard drive. Only one thing remained untouched: Togo. He had barked all night. But Luis had been too late. They were erasing the story. Chapter 17. Fire in the pews. Then came the fire. It started at midnight. Flames erupted from inside the chapel. The sky above El Carmino glowed red, like hell itself had opened. Luis raced to the scene, but it was too late. The altar collapsed. The floor, the graves, the names, all consumed by flame. Only ashes remained. Togo stood beside him, howling. They hadn't just silenced the dead. They tried to silence the truth. But Luis had seen too much. He wasn't alone anymore. Rosa stood beside him. And as the other women, one by one they emerged from the shadows. Personal reflection. They say the truth will set you free. But in towns like El Carmino, the truth first sets fire to every illusion you've built your faith upon. Sometimes evil doesn't fear discovery, it expects silence. But once one voice rises, others will follow. One bark becomes a howl. One testimony becomes a movement. You cannot bury the dead when their ghosts still walk among the living. Chapter 18. The Station That Listened. The day after the fire, Luis stood in front of a crumbling chapel and made a choice. He wasn't going to whisper anymore. He drove to Santiago del Sol, a nearby city where the local media still retained some shred of integrity. There, he knocked on the glass door of Radio Viva, an old station that mostly played nostalgic boleros and Sunday sermons. I need a live segment, Luis said to the receptionist. I have a story the world needs to hear. Minutes later, he was sitting across from Lena Vasquez, a young journalist known for her investigative work on political corruption. She had fierce eyes and no patience for melodrama. Is this another angry man with a grudge against the church? She asked. Luis didn't respond. He simply placed a USB drive on the table. She plugged it in. Then she listened. Testimonies, names, photos, video footage of the bones, the journals, the altar before the fire, the dog barking at the coffin. She paled. And then she hit record. Chapter 19. On Air and Under Attack. That evening, the segment aired across the region. Luis's voice was raw, emotional, but unwavering. I buried my niece believing she had drowned. But what really drowned was the truth. Her name was Camila, and she died trying to escape a monster that wore the cloth of God. Within hours, Radio Viva's servers crashed from traffic. Hashtags flooded social media. Hashtag justice for Camila. Hashtag El Carmino truth. Hashtag the priest and the bones. But not everyone celebrated the exposure. The following day, masked men smashed the windows of the station. Luis received anonymous texts. "You should have stayed silent. You'll bury your whole family if you keep digging." And Lena? She was pulled off air. But not before uploading the segment to 5 independent platforms. The truth had escaped the town's walls. Now it was spreading like wildfire. Chapter 20. The Church Responds. 3 days later, the diocese released an official statement. "We mourn the loss of Father Aurelio, a servant of God whose legacy has been tarnished by unverified claims. We urge our followers to pray for peace and reject divisive rumors." A press conference was held at the city cathedral. Luis attended. This time he didn't come alone. Rosa stood beside him, holding Camila's last drawing. Inés came arm in arm with 3 other survivors. Luis waited until the archbishop finished speaking. Then he walked to the microphone. "If these are just rumors," he said, "why did you seal the journals before the police ever saw them? Why burn the chapel? Why silence the victims?" Silence fell over the crowd. But the archbishop remained composed. "Pain makes people see ghosts where there are shadows." Luis stared at him. "And silence lets the shadows multiply." Chapter 21. When the past screams. Meanwhile, in El Carmino, the townspeople grew restless. Some still defended Father Aurelio. Others began to question everything they once believed. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly man named Santiago Ruiz, a former altar boy in the 1960s, came forward. "I saw things," he said. "Things I was told to forget. But I never did." He revealed a second location, an old root cellar behind the rectory, sealed with bricks. Luis returned to El Carmino and broke the seal himself. Inside, small bones, a broken crucifix, and a torn piece of cloth embroidered with the name Mateo. Another child. Another name buried beneath the silence. The evidence was irrefutable now. Chapter 22. Faces of the Forgotten. Luis created a wall. A real one. Across from the charred chapel, he mounted photographs, drawings, names, and dates, each representing a victim believed to have been harmed or silenced. Locals began stopping by. Some cried. Some prayed. Some just stood in silence, reading the names. One by one, more stories came forward. A mother whispered, "He kissed my son's forehead every Sunday. I thought it was love." A janitor revealed, "I found stains on the confessional. They told me it was wine." A nurse shared, "I treated a girl for bruises in '98. Her mother told me to shut up." Each story was a new wound, reopened after years of denial. But wounds must bleed before they can heal. Chapter 23. The Dog That Never Forgot. Togo remained by Luis's side through everything. He no longer barked without cause. But each time they passed the rebuilt chapel or what remained of it, he'd pause, ears forward, tail tense. He remembered. He was the first to speak when others stayed silent. A dog had remembered what the town had forced itself to forget. Togo became a symbol featured on protest signs, murals, hashtags. He wasn't just Camila's dog anymore. He was truth's first sentinel. Personal reflection. This part of the journey taught me something difficult. Truth doesn't set you free immediately. It enrages, divides, burns, and bleeds before it liberates. But it's worth the pain. Because silence, left to fester, becomes complicity. Luis showed us that you don't need power to fight back. You need courage, and something worth losing. Camila's drawing, the girl in the black box, no longer stayed in the shadows. She had found her voice. Chapter 24. The Letter That Broke Everything. The morning after uncovering Mateo's name, Luis returned to Rosa's home, where the dog Togo lay curled beside Camila's old shoes. Rosa was holding something. A letter. It had arrived anonymously. No return address. No stamp. Just slipped under the door. Luis unfolded the envelope. Inside was a confession. Handwritten. Trembling script. the kind of writing done in guilt or fear or both. I knew, I saw, and I said nothing, because I feared him more than I feared God. It was signed, Esteban Duran. Luis froze. Esteban, his childhood friend, the same man who had carried Camila's coffin, the one who led hymns every Sunday, sitting in the front pew with folded hands. Luis's knees buckled. All this time, someone close had known, and done nothing. Chapter 25, Confrontation. Luis didn't scream. He didn't cry. He drove straight to Esteban's farm on the edge of El Camino. He found him outside, feeding his chickens like any other morning. "Did you write this?" Luis asked, holding up the letter. Esteban looked up slowly. His eyes carried centuries of guilt. "Yes," he whispered, "and I'm ready to be punished." Luis grabbed his collar. "Why didn't you speak? Camila could have." "I was a boy when I saw it first," Esteban said, trembling. "I thought it was just a mistake, until I saw it again and again. And by then I was too weak to fight him. Too weak to fight the church." He looked away. "I was just scared." Luis stepped back. There were no punches thrown. No justice in fists. Only the slow agony of betrayal. Chapter 26, The Trial That Shook the Cross. The firestorm reached the capital. The case of the El Camino Bones, as it came to be called, captured international attention. Luis, alongside Lina, Rosa, and over 27 witnesses, brought forth evidence to the National Tribunal. Photos, journals, names, testimonies, even Esteban's confession. The church tried to stall, to bury it in bureaucracy. But public outcry was too loud. Togo's image painted across murals, printed on banners, was now the face of resistance. One bishop resigned. 2 others were arrested for covering up reports from the 1990s. The Diocese of Santiago del Sol was forced to release sealed archives. Among them, dozens of buried cases, reassignments of priests, and internal memos admitting to abuse. For the first time in decades, a church was held accountable. Chapter 27, The Children Return. Weeks later, something strange began to happen. Former residents of El Camino who had left as children returned. They came with stories, memories. "Babe, I was 6. He locked me in the prayer room," said a woman now in her 40s. "I screamed and my mother thought I was possessed." Another man, a former soldier, shared, "He told me if I told anyone, I'd burn in hell." I still hear that at night. Luis listened to each one, never interrupting, never correcting, just listening. He realized the town wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by denial. The people had silenced their own children out of fear, out of faith, out of ignorance. But now, those children had voices again. Chapter 28, The Rebuilt Wall. Luis rebuilt the wall. But this time it wasn't just photos. It became a monument. At the base of the old chapel ruins, he constructed a circular memorial, names etched in black stone, one for each child believed to have suffered. In the center, a bronze sculpture, a little girl holding a candle, her dog by her side. Camila and Togo, always watching, always remembering. People came from across the country, to mourn, to reflect, to weep, and to learn. Chapter 29, Reflections in the Flame. One evening, Luis stood before the monument with Lina and Rosa. The sun was setting. The light cast long shadows over the names. "This was never just about Camila," Lina said softly. Luis nodded. "It never is. One name carries hundreds." Rosa added, "We thought faith was enough. But faith without truth is just another lie." Togo barked once. A reminder, a warning, and a blessing. Luis finally let himself cry. Not in rage, but in release. The truth hadn't just survived the fire. It had become the flame. Chapter 30, The Final Word. In the last chapter of this journey, Luis published a book titled, The Girl in the Black Box, Truth, Faith, and the Fire That Freed Us. It became a symbol of reckoning, a required reading in schools, not because it solved everything, but because it proved that truth is a long road paved by ordinary people who choose not to stay silent. Camila became more than a victim. She became a voice, a mirror, and a memory that would never be buried again. If this story moved you, if you felt anger, sadness, reflection, or even hope, then let it guide you. Speak for the voiceless. Protect those who are too afraid to speak. Question power, even when it wears robes. And remember, sometimes it takes a barking dog to wake an entire town from silence. Share this story. Start conversations. Break the cycle. Because silence is never neutral, and truth is worth everything.